Everybody, this is Janina from Mochi Mag, and I'm here with
John Cho.
Yay! We're so excited to talk to him about his book, Troublemaker. And I'd love to start by just asking you, you said in the author's note that you were inspired by your children to write this book, but I would love to hear a little bit more about how this book came to be.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like we have some of the same origin stories or the same origin points, but I had a deal to write a children's book, and I'd always thought it would be cool to have, an Asian American boy on the cover of a book, going into a library and seeing that. I thought that would be really special. And that's where the original impetus was. And I was going to write a fun book, and then 2020 rolled around, and right when we were sort of settling on what the book might be, and we were locked up at home like you, and with COVID on the rise, and we were watching the Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd. And there was this rising tide of anti-Asian violence, and the kids were at home. So there was a lot to process, and we were thinking about a lot of things. And I guess as a parent, I went to, how are my kids processing this? I wonder what they're thinking. What should we tell them? What should we not tell them? And in that process, I'm sorry, this is a long story. And in that process, I started thinking about the 92 riots of Los Angeles and a very similar incident of police brutality, the Rodney King beating, and the consequences of that event. And I was in a period of reflection. And so then the idea came, I wonder what that event might have been like for a kid. And so that's where the book was born. A person that was very impactful for me is someone we interviewed named Richard Choi, who was a broadcaster at Radio Korea, and which turned out to be a really important resource for Koreans in terms of telling them where the riots were moving and how to get to safety, and then relief aid, and dispensing really critical information. But anyway, he had a really interesting perspective, which was that prior to the riots, his opinion was that Koreans really kind of conceived of themselves as sojourners through this country, and weren't sure whether they were going to put down roots. This is generally speaking, of course, but after the riots, they realized that they were here, that they'd spilled blood, and that they needed to take steps to ensure that the country was going to work for them. And so to that end, he says he saw a proliferation of Korean Americans enter politics. He hadn't seen that before, and activism in a way that he hadn't seen before. And so in that trauma, I think he said we went from being Koreans in America to Korean Americans. So I think that was a very interesting perspective that I don't think I understood fully.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I haven't heard that before. And it's so amazing that you were able to base this book off of interviews with people like that.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of pivoting. I'm wondering, you mentioned that you felt a lot of fear during the LA riots. I'm wondering, what role does the media play in the events that took place during the LA riots?
Yeah, I mean, there were really, there's a phrase that, I'll start here. There's a phrase that I hear a lot in the media, which is these two words, race relations. And I often think that that's kind of missing the point. That is to say that it's not about whether we like one another. It is about systems of justice and economic equality that are driving a lot of this stuff. And I think the media going back to also the murder of Latasha Harlins, really kind of amped up the tensions between Koreans and African Americans. That was a murder of a minor that was shown on television on loop thousands of times, and it framed the Los Angeles riots as exclusively kind of this conflict between two groups of color, when the inciting incident really was decades of police brutality against African Americans that culminated in, Rodney King being beaten, and then the officers being acquitted in the face of very plain video evidence. So, and then the police cars left Koreatown in South Central and went to the Federal Building in Westwood. So there was no police presence whatsoever. So while there were real tensions between African Americans and Koreans, I think it was certainly exacerbated by the media coverage and the kind of explicit framing of that event as a conflict between those two groups. And I think that's only part of the story.
I'm just wondering, what do you think Asian Americans can do to foster more solidarity with other communities of color?
Well, what I have a kind of, my perspective on it is that we all ought to be in search of social justice, economic justice, and human rights. And if you're in favor of those things, you're always going to be on the side of people who are not receiving equal treatment under the law. So to that end, I hope that I would like to build bridges with any community that is not being equally treated under the law. So absolutely, and that means a conscious effort. And yeah, I guess I see it more of a human under the umbrella of a human rights issue.
Definitely. I think that that's, the approach that lots of people who take the social justice framework, want to share, is that we're all human beings. We all deserve to be treated fairly and justly so that we can thrive in our society. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. That was a great conversation. I appreciate you having me.